I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Thankfully, we see some carryover, see some people here for the third time. This is the third week of our Grid Unlock series. And as I've done at the beginning of each, want to thank you all for being here. Know most of you in the room. I'm glad to be meeting some new faces as well. But want to give a little bit of a background on what we're doing here and then kind of what took place in the first couple weeks in case you missed them, and give you some information on where you can find the topics, the videos, and the slide decks from what took place the first couple weeks. But just a general background of what we're trying to do here and where this came from. The Chamber is on an October 1 fiscal year, so we just started our fiscal year 17-18, and like every organization, as we scope the landscape for what we're going to do in the upcoming year, we just had a think tank session of, hey, what are the things that people just simply cannot stop talking about in Sarasota County and in the city of Sarasota, and we've got together about 5 or 6 items that we see in the newspaper every day, we see at the coffee shop, we see over dinner at the dinner table, and we try to look over those issues as to, hey, what can we do about these things? How can we try to work the issue in this community? And as it related to transportation, what struck our mind was we could try to kind of do some educational programming, elevate the conversation, really figure out what's going on with transportation, how does it interact with this community, how do we interact with it, and what are some opportunities we have to address it. And I've mentioned before, it's of particular interest to me. I'm a self-professed giant nerd, and transportation is one of those things over time in Sarasota County. When you go back and you read Sarasota County's first comprehensive plan, they did a pretty good introduction where they outlined they called the community concerns, and they listed 3 or 4 things that the community was just burning about, and wouldn't you know it, transportation was one of them. We had a traffic problem, and so for 50 years we've been sitting here just shrugging our shoulders about traffic, and it's the never-ending issue. So what can we do to lend some illumination to that issue, and what can we do to be a part of it to help really better the future of what we have here? And so in week 1, we had Damian Miller, who's a principal at Tyndale Oliver, a firm out of Tampa who does a lot of work here in the city of Sarasota and Sarasota County, come down and kind of give us a basic run through of what is traffic, what are vehicle miles traveled, how has that been changing over time, how do we measure what's happening, and how do we look at what's happening. And it was really just intended to be a baseline. Hey, can we all talk the same language? Can we all kind of look at things from a collective lens where we don't have to just throw our arms up in the air and say, it took me 15 minutes to get to Publix and I really thought it should take 10. And so, what a disaster. But to really understand how vehicles interact with the roadway system. And then last week we had Rich Biter, who was a former Assistant Secretary of the Florida Department of Transportation, to come in and talk about transit systems. So talked about what was changing over time with transit systems, how transit systems are funded, how they're planned for, what do we do from a kind of a global perspective. And then we wanted to come here tonight to bring the third week in this series of traffic studies and land use. So when we look at what we're doing as a community and we look at our land use and then we do traffic studies around our land use, how does that impact what we do, what we don't do, and how that ultimately comes out in the roadway network that you all travel on a daily basis and what you end up seeing. And we were really lucky to be joined along with this program with a number of partners who also identify transportation and transit to be a real critical function of what we do here in this community. Gulf Coast Community Foundation is a fantastic partner of ours. They do a regional scan on a semi-regular basis. They just did one in 2016, and wouldn't you know it, transportation and traffic was one of their top issues for this community, and so they've joined us in partnering with us in this event. We are also very lucky to have SRQ Media as a media partner for this event. Very local, focused media organization that understands just how that impacts not only the readers but the advertisers and the stories that they are telling. Of course, the Tableside Restaurant Group hoping us here at the Francis, making this a reality for us and hosting us in the evening. And of course, Eric, cameraman in the back, always making sure these things are online for us. And I would invite you to go to this website, slideshare.net, Greater Sarasota Chamber, to see everything we've done in the past from the slide deck perspective and also from the video perspective. And at the end, we will put out a collective piece outlining everything we did over the past 6 weeks. So, with that, what I'll do to introduce tonight's speakers and tonight's topic is introduce kind of really the ringleader of this. I'm just the mouthpiece who did all the legwork and really helped put all these things together. Partner at Hoyt Architects and former chair of the Chamber Board, Chris Gallagher.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, we have challenged our speaker today with, we call this the most difficult week. Christopher Hatton from Kimley-Horn is going to talk about traffic studies, and his job is to keep everyone alive and alert for his presentation. And I've seen his slideshow, and I think he's going to be successful, but you ultimately will be the judge of that. Christopher has got a huge career here in Sarasota County. Has been in this business for a quarter of a century, but has been involved in many projects in the city and the county of Sarasota. And again, for those of you who have not been here before, we will do a Q&A at the end of that. So if you've got any specific questions for him related to any of that, he'll be happy to take those. Christopher is a graduate of Georgia Tech. He's got a master's degree and an undergraduate degree from Georgia Tech. We've got one fan back there in the room. Now, in addition to Christopher, sort of unannounced here, we had, for some of you that saw the 6-week schedule, good. Liz, grab a seat. Liz has been a regular here. Thank you, Commissioner Albert, for being here each week. In addition, we've got this other little mini topic that we're going to do at the end, and I think it'll be a bit of a surprise for many of you in terms of the subject and what does that have to do with automobile congestion and traffic and things. We've got Mark Lyons, who is the parking manager for the city of Sarasota. Mark also has got about a quarter century of experience in public and private sector, a lot of it private sector, helping people manage congestion in very large cities and airports and things. And again, I think for some of you this will be some interesting and surprising thoughts about how parking policy in an urban area affects congestion. So again, we'll have Q&A opportunity for both those guys at the end of it. So with no further ado, Mr. Christopher Hatton. Chris?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak in front of you all tonight. See some real transportation gurus from around, Alex from the city, Isaac from Longboat, and Paula from the county. So they're going to keep me in line for sure. So it's appreciate, again, once this opportunity that we're going to talk about from transportation. I've been working, as Chris said, for the last 26 years. Actually, on October 7th, I celebrated my 26th year with Kimley-Horn. And even though I'm born and raised in Tampa, I've probably done about 75% of my projects in Sarasota County, starting back in Palmer Ranch days back in October of '91. So I've really I've learned it there, and I've kind of been given the topic that I really live and breathe every day. So I'm going to try to touch on some topics that are hopefully very topical. But at the same time, in the middle, we're going to actually try to get in a little bit to truly what a traffic study is, because I think there's a key point in this, and that's trying to make sure that the public can be educated as much. And again, I know we have a time for a Q&A at the end, so if you certainly have those questions, I'd certainly love to answer those specific questions. So I've got anywhere from 40 to 50 slides, so I'm going to try to go through them pretty quick. Like I said, if I'm going too fast, let me know, but I certainly want to leave time for Mark here to talk about parking as well. Real quick, just some of the topics I'm going to run through, specifically focus on the impact studies, talking a little bit advantages or disadvantages, a little quickly about the difference between, for instance, here locally between the city and the county, and then walk through, majority of my slides are going to be talking about what a transportation impact statement or study is. Then want to bring it really close to what we are doing now in the county as well as the city, obviously focusing on things that are more multimodal, and that's multiple modes as opposed to just cars, which for years, decades even, the focus was really just specifically cars. Now we're really focusing on bicycles, pedestrians, transit, which is a great thing, and certainly I think a lot of you probably heard the term now, complete streets. And we are trying to focus not just on vehicles, but those other modes. And so we'll talk a little bit about what the old school was, the concurrency and impact fees, but now what we're doing with a mobility fee and what the jurisdictions that I work in every day in terms of the city and the county. I think it's important to understand, again, why traffic studies are done and the benefits that they could bring. Certainly, just trying to accurately identify what traffic can do. I think it's important to understand that cannot be basically done just at the drop of a button or at the flip of a switch. It takes a while to do. The good part is even with our knowledge, we've got the knowledge with jurisdictions that we work in. We determine a methodology, a study methodology, which we'll kind of walk through a little bit, so that we're doing a study, and even if I'm doing it for the public, and I work on both the private side for private development as well as public. I've worked for both Sarasota County and the city of Sarasota. So it's something that I think, and you have a reputation certainly to do. You have to do it right, and you have to follow a methodology from that standpoint. One of these things I think it's really important to see, and this is not just here in the county, but there's a lot of times, especially in times of big development growth, staff is just burdened with not being able to do it. Now, and I'll get to another slide in a minute, there is the differences in terms of how like the city does it, where they have consultants on board, where in Sarasota County, they will review our studies, but we do them individually. And again, the amount of studies, I again cannot imagine a lot of times what Paula and her staff have to do with just the studies that I produce from my staff, and they have it from all the Raleigh County. So it's the benefit to be able to give them the ability to, hopefully do something that's been agreed upon in a methodology that we could get to them to review and then provide comments. Obviously, a big thing is to try to identify what improvements need to be done in the community, and that's what's called a capital improvement program. The county or the city have an improvement program that the improvements that are called for in the traffic studies, generally, if they are agreed upon by the county, they are put in a CIP so that they can be developed. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, the mobility fee that is being collected, those fees that are collected help to pay for those improvements. And last, I think the most important thing is, again, Alex, Isaac, and Paula live this every day, being able to try to explain kind of what we do to not only the public, and again, I think this is a great series, again, and my hat's off to Kevin and Chris for putting this together, as well as the sponsors, to help educate the public. It's something that, I still learn something new each and every day. And I've got partners, whether, again, stuff from Mark that I don't necessarily understand about parking, but I've got partners and I've got folks at agencies that help educate me, and you always want to be doing that. And again, I've been through enough public hearings, through planning commissions, board of county commissioners, where it's important to be able to educate at any type of level what we're doing so that could be better understood. Kind of to talk about the disadvantage, and I think the reason I say that is kind of in the old days of concurrency, where when you had to actually, back in, started in 1985, you had to build your improvements before you could actually build your development. That was the old-fashioned concurrency, if you will. And so what people would do is, if they were in an area where there was heavy traffic and they couldn't afford the improvements, well, they'd move out further and move out further. And so basically that's something that's called sprawl. And that wasn't necessarily good because the infrastructure had to be built out there. So that was some of the disadvantages of having the concurrency rules and regulations that started back in 1985. But now with the new rules, we have mobility fees, which is a fee you pay that will fund those types. No matter what the improvements, whether or not you have improvements or not related, you are going to have a fee that you are going to pay associated with your development. We get in a little bit more at the very end. And again, right now, this is where, again, this is where a lot of jurisdictions out of the 67 counties that we have in the state, a lot of places, not only the counties but the cities, are going to mobility fees where it's basically a pay and go. And a lot of people aren't necessarily happy with that. They don't want to see just pay and go to be able to have, we need to be able to do the things. But that's, again, each jurisdiction, they decide on which to do that. Obviously, there was a big push going through that with the county just recently. And then I think the point here that I think is really important to understand, and we'll touch on this a little bit, there is still a requirement to do a transportation study, even though you have a mobility fee. We deal with operational studies, and whether that deals with identifying turn lanes, special high crash accident areas, so the safety aspect, or other ones that, again, the county is going through that right now to try to specifically identify what that is. So just because we're in the mobility fee of paying your mobility fee, you don't get let off the hook and you're not doing anything. You have to still do a detailed traffic study, whether it be operational, turn lanes, or safety. So that is still being done. Just real quick, again, the county They adopted the mobility fee back in January 1st, 2016. Again, still an operational study still has to be done, and then there are still things that are being going through the multimodal methodology, which the county is working with the community right now to try to identify what else needs to be evaluated. Again, usually from the multimodal perspective, which is great. Again, pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit. The city right now, if you go through a development, the city actually has consultants such as Tyndale Oliver, Kimley-Horn, and others that are on staff that conduct the studies. They have been doing them for years. They follow the methodology that the city dictates, so they are done under that purview. Just a real quick, this is something that is kind of by the transportation impact analysis from IT. Basically just says that a traffic study needs to be done by an educated and experienced transportation professional, and it needs to forecast and analyze the needs for developments and how crucial that is. We want to quickly kind of go through, again, what a transportation impact study is. Again, I'm going to try to flip through these pretty quick, but I think there's some points that I think are important to know, especially when we're in a hearing and we say there's 200 trips that are generated from this development in the PM peak hour. Well, the trips that are done would basically be how many vehicles would be those 200 trips? It's kind of a trick question because it's not 200 vehicles. It's a trip in. So an origin coming into the development, and then when you leave. That could be one vehicle, but it's making 2 trip-ins. So if it comes in within the peak hour, it could be just 100 vehicles, but they're making 200 trips. So there's details like that, so that when we say that there's X number of trips, and then somebody says, well, there's 200 vehicles that are in there. Well, it's not necessarily 200 vehicles to equal 200 trip-ins. So those are some of the details there. Real quickly, I'm just going to go through some of this as it relates to project traffic. Trip generation, I think, is real important. We follow a book that's called the Trip Generation Manual. And this is an excerpt from one of those where it's actually just getting ready. The 10th edition just came out a few days ago. And these are basically a collection of studies that are done throughout the United States since as far back as the 1960s. So they will study, in this case, the fast food restaurant with a drive-through window. These are all the source numbers of all the studies that were done that basically give you an equation here and a rate that you actually apply. For this case is a daily. This is a weekday. So per 1,000 square feet, you have 496 trip-ins per 1,000 square feet. So we use a book to do that. So this is not something that, again, is just, thought up and we come up with a random number. It's the industry standard. Now, you can also do a detailed study if, for instance, you're coming up with let's say a Wawa gas station. The FDOT has come up. They actually did studies at several Wawas and actually came up with a rate that they want to see. If you're going in front of the DOT for a study, that you have to use the trip rate that they've studied for about over a dozen Wawa studies, because they didn't basically think that the IT manual really portrayed the Wawa gas stations. There are things like this that I think they're important to know. The pass-by capture. Pass-by capture, those are the trips that basically are already on the road. So you might put in a Wawa gas station, and it might, quote-unquote, generate, let's say, again, 200 trips during the PM peak hour, but 100 of those trips are folks that were already on the road. They just happened to see you, and it was on their way home or on their way to work, and they pull in, and they'll pull back out. So that's a trip that basically you don't have to, quote-unquote, pay for, because it's not one that you put on the roadway network. So this, for a good example, let's say here's your development, and you've got traffic that's going up and around this avenue, a pass-by trip, and that all of a sudden, you open last week, you come in here, you come into the development, and then you leave. The only thing that this actually did was drew you out of the roadway into the development. Now, a new trip would be one that basically was over here that was not going on this roadway and said, hey, I need to go get some gas. I'm going to go here and then travel back. So that's a new trip, and this is just what's one trip. Now, if this was a larger development, for instance, and let's say it was a gas station, but it also had an office development up here, well, there's stuff that's called internal capture. And internal capture, those are the trips that basically happen on site. So the trips that will be generated from, let's say, the gas station and the office will interact between each other. And you basically have to recognize those, because those will happen. You'll go ahead and leave your office, go to the gas station, and then pull out. Well, there was one trip there, and then your second trip did hit the roadway, but your first one did not. And again, kind of in summary, when you're looking at kind of the driveway volume, to basically that you calculate, remember that 496 trips that I identified per 1,000 square feet, you have to take out the external capture that happens on site, and then you have the external trips, the trips that are happening outside of the development, and then you basically subtract out the pass-by capture that's already on the roadway, and those are basically what we evaluate is the new external trips. And the new external trips are the ones, for instance, that we evaluate even today for like mobility fees. So you are paying for what you are either creating or you're creating to come to your development. The trip distribution is important because it's where did the trips come from? Now again, I don't want to be too in detail because again, trying to keep you awake so before Mark gets up here. So basically, I'll just kind of go through this quickly. But the distribution obviously is looked at on a roadway, for instance, eastbound, westbound. We take into consider usually models, and these are, for instance, FDOT District 1 now, and this is the community, Sarasota County, is within FDOT's District 1, which is 16 counties, and they have a model that we all have to use to be able to identify. So again, we use the IT Trip Generation Manual for trip generation identification, and then we use the FDOT District 1 approved model to tell us where it's coming from. So, a lot of people, I've heard it all over 26 years, think that we're, kind of making up these numbers, this black box and everything. So I've heard it for many years. But we, again, have methodologies that we must follow, and then we have tools that we must follow as well. The mode choice, I think, and again, this is really important because this has become, in the last 5 or 10 years, a much more important focus, and I think it's really critical because, as more and more folks, even though we're in the Sunshine State, more and more people are getting out biking. They understand exercise. The Department of Health certainly sees that there are grants that they are giving for making communities more walkable, more bike-friendly. There's designations, there are all those types of things that are really important. And so we get to recognize that, and obviously we're maybe not as progressive as some places, maybe as Portland or some of the others, but we try to identify, again, back in the day when all it was focusing on the automobile. Every single trip was just an automobile trip. Now we realize that people do take transit. Certainly they bike, they walk, and even from a truck standpoint. Now as you can see, the amount of trips that we assign to that is very low. I mean, just let's be honest, we are here in Florida, and unless your community is something like you've heard probably a neo-traditional where you can actually get mixed-use development where folks will really walk to like a celebration or something like that. It's not always going to be a high number, but it's important to recognize. And then lastly, assignment. We've got the trips that we've generated. We figured out where, per the model, they're going per a distribution, and we need to assign those to the roadway network. And here's just an example when people say, well, what does that model look like? So we actually do an analysis where we'll put in the model, and this is actually a figure, so it's not really a star, but what it prints out is this is what we call a centroid. It'll show where the traffic is going, 95% here, 5% here, and it goes throughout the network. And we use that to identify where the traffic is. And again, that's based on certain socioeconomic data that's in this model based upon employees, office, et cetera. Basically attractions and productions. So those are the type of things without getting too boring. So some of the analysis, again, this is some of the stuff that, again, goes into the details that I think are truly important in what we do. We look at existing traffic because now, based upon the legislation that happened in 2011, the Community Planning Act, what they basically evaluated was that you shouldn't be burdened with quote-unquote sins of the past. So you do an existing analysis for the traffic that is on the road now. Then you look at the future year, let's say your anticipated build-out year, and then you look at non-project. So that's basically, let's say it's 2017, and you're expecting your project to build out in 2020. Well, you do an analysis for the year 2020. And then you basically see what's working, what's failing, roadways, intersections, turn lanes. But let's say you have 3 intersections that are failing during the 2020 non-project, that's without your project, just in the future, based upon your study area, that are not working. Those you don't have to pay for. You basically can assume intersection improvements to then bring up those to basically level of service standards. And then you do your project, you add your project, you do a total traffic analysis, and I'll get into that in just a minute, and those are the improvements that you have to pay for, either through prop share or individual turn lanes, et cetera. Again, kind of I mentioned the study area, and real quick, the study area is based solely on the jurisdiction. So the way Sarasota County does it, Longboat Key, and the city of Sarasota are all a little bit different. But it's based upon their jurisdictional rules, and those are what we have to follow. So when a study is done, and I've seen many of presentations that, Paula has to be up there to defend either the questions from the board about, why we didn't look at that intersection or why we didn't look at that. Well, it's not in the regulations that we have to do that. So we follow these, and that's the part of the education purpose that we're trying to do specifically here tonight. This is just an example, such as trying to identify a type of shopping center. So you could have the small commercial sites and just an estimate of terms of what they would generate traffic-wise. And this will give you just a quick idea of the study area about what would actually have to do. So if you're under about 200 trips during the peak hour, you'd basically just look at the adjacent intersection, the adjacent roadway. If you're getting up to the 200 to 500 area, you'd go to all the signals and roads within about a half mile, and the major unsignalized intersections within a quarter mile. And as it grows, obviously the study area that you have to do increases. The existing volumes, and I was talking with Jerry Dovkowski there, it's very interesting how innovation and technology has changed. I remember when I started my career, I'll never forget actually counting an intersection during the PM peak hour at Bee Ridge and Cattleman. Literally in one of those chairs, and all I did was eat exhaust fumes for 2 hours. It was horrible, but that's what and I actually had a count board. It was a manual count board where I actually clicked in all the intersections. So I tried to be as accurate as I could, and trying to wipe the sweat and all that stuff. But nowadays, even though you're seeing this person actually have a chair and do an electric count board, almost, I'd say probably about 90% of all the data collection that is done through video, which is great. Because now, again, you have people that kind of say, hey, those volumes aren't correct. No, that's not what's really on my road, or et cetera. You have a DVD. Here you go. You can take a look at it. And that's the great part. You have the data. You have to be able to back it. So this is what we do, and we have that ability. Now, one of the things, I'm not sure if it's on this slide, I know you talked about it week 1, and again, peak season. Obviously, you can count the traffic in October, but is it going to be the same that's in February? Obviously not. Now, again, I don't want to go into what Damien talked about, but there are adjustment factors, obviously, that adjust that. And that's, for instance, one of the items here, the peak season. And, of course, there are certain things like, special event traffic and the like that have to be evaluated depending on the development that you're looking at. Again, I talked a little bit about the future non-project, which is, the background traffic. And again, we are held to a very high standards based upon the methodologies that we have to do. So whether we're looking at growth rates or we're looking at the thing that I'm sure you've all heard about, vested traffic that comes, those are other developments that have been approved. So those ones that have already been approved, they might not be built yet, but if they're approved, we have to account for them. So we have to make sure and take those into account. Again, there are all of these, depending on the different jurisdictions, that, again, they vary a little bit, is what we have to include in our traffic analysis. Some of the future non-project things also are also the improvements that might be in the capital improvement program, which I talked about a little bit earlier. If you actually have an improvement that's being funded, you can account for that as long as it's one that's within the next 3 years. So those are the type of improvements that can also be included in our study. I always like this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson: when a road is once built, it is a strange thing how it collects traffic. And it's one of those things, if you've ever heard it, it's called latent demand. If you build a road, they will come. So that type of thing. We actually just finished up a comp plan analysis for a project that is just east of I-75, just south of Clark, for Ibis Road. So we're looking at the potential for the extension, and we're actually doing this as part of working with the county on that, trying to evaluate if that was extended to a future north-south what they call Road A, what that would do. So we use the model to evaluate what traffic might do. Now, obviously, if that is connected down to those roads, especially with all the developments out there, what will happen to traffic? So those are the type of things that we do each and every day. And again, I think I mentioned that the total future conditions are the analysis that we do to try to identify what impact that the project has that has to be accounted for and that the developer has to pay for. Now, again, there's the prop share, which some of you might have heard, which is a proportionate share. You have to pay for basically the impacts that you cause. And again, in the case of where there's mobility fees, there's really not so much prop share anymore, but there's a mobility fee that's based upon the trips that you generate, the lengths that they go, and the amount of traffic that's on the road. I wanted to kind of get to a couple of things that I think are pretty exciting from the site access point. And these really deal not only with the county, but also with FDOT. And I know Dave's here, so I'm sorry for not pointing you out here. From a jurisdictional standpoint, being able to realize that we're held to very high standards, especially when like the DOT comes into. And they're really, their purview is mainly, especially certainly their roads, but site access and dealing with certain criteria that we have to meet. So for instance, when we're looking at site access issues, access management is what they call it, trying to limit the amount of access that we have on the major roadways. The functionality of a road, especially when it is what they call higher classification of a road, they want to keep people and freight moving. If it's what they call a road that's more of a local road or a collector road, that's more for folks to build houses on, or for roads to basically collect traffic from other roads to ultimately funnel it to something called an arterial, which is again one of those higher functional classification roads. So again, these are type of principles that we're trying to follow, limiting the number of conflict points. So then we try to identify from our perspective, our development, how many driveways should be out onto a roadway. And these are the type of things such as, again, driveway spacing. Here's an example of the FDOT's criteria based upon the classification of a roadway. And these are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7 is something more like a, let's say a B ridge that has, a large number of, driveways and the like, that you really realize you have to, provide access for the large number of businesses that are out there. So this will tell you the type of medians that are out there. And then based upon the type of access that you're looking for, median openings or just a driveway, this is the actual, and this is in feet, the spacing that you have to do. And this is basically the guidance that has pretty much been in existence. It's called, from the Florida Administrative Code, 1496 and 1497. It is identified. And again, each jurisdiction will then classify. A lot of this is based upon the local jurisdiction, and they'll use this type of classifications, but based upon their identification of which roads would meet, like again, whether it be a class 2, which is very high, almost like a highway, down to one that has several driveways. I think another important aspect, for instance, of site access is queuing. One of the things that a lot of people, whether you're dealing with things like banks, although not so much obviously, but certainly gas stations and fast food restaurants, those are very important in terms of how you can identify queuing. I'm doing a project right now for a charter school, and the amount of queuing that's actually happening on site for school pickup is enormous, especially when you get up to a site that might be as much as 1,250 students. So we've actually identified a path that they would come off a road and actually have 4 lanes all the way around the school, ultimately to the pickup. So the amount of capacity that is, but you don't want it spilling back onto the roadway. So these are, for instance, just some of the calculations that either at unsignalized intersections or at signalized intersections we use to help identify, and there's also some of those that will help us identify things like, for an example that I was talking about, schools, so that queuing doesn't spill back, because I'm sure everybody can probably list 2, 3, 4 schools that probably spill back out into the roadway as they're waiting for kids. One of the important things I think also that is coming up, and I think the county is trying to focus a little bit more on this, is high hazard areas, crashes. Obviously safety, and certainly the transportation industry is really focusing more. It's something called Vision Zero, and that's to try to have 0 traffic deaths in the state of Florida. And I think it was pretty, I was at a hearing in Polk County, and there was this kind of a public service advertisement that was really, it hit home. And they asked a question. They went into basically a park, and they asked, how many, traffic fatalities do you think take place in the state of Florida over the period of a year? And so, I mean, they were asking, 10-year-old kids, they were asking dads, moms, et cetera, and it was, from hundreds to thousands. And then they said, okay, well, how many is acceptable in the state? They're like, okay, well, I don't know, maybe 1,000 or something like that and everything, or maybe 100 and stuff like that. And then they asked, well, how many is acceptable in your family? And obviously the answer was 0. Well, the answer is 0. It should be 0 for everything. So it's one of those things that I think, just like complete streets is a really important thing to focus on. I think certainly high hazard areas, safety, crashes, those type of things are. And again, it's something that I know the county and the city and other places are taking a more important look at, and I think that's something that you'll see more and more of. And again, we do a lot of analysis for that. You try to identify sometimes where a traffic signal goes. Sometimes that is one of what they call a warrant of how a signal gets warranted or comes into place. And one of those warrants is accident safety based upon the number of crashes that possibly could have been prevented if a traffic signal was there. And again, kind of wrapping up here with the recommendations in terms of a traffic study, we look at the site plan, which is a critical aspect, and I'll give kudos especially to the city for that. That was, and they've been doing this for well over almost probably 2 decades, looking at site access, probably a lot better than a lot of other jurisdictions, because they really have said, how is the pedestrian getting out to the roadway? So that internal circulation from anything from internal sidewalks out and the like. So we've seen that in many different areas. In some places, unfortunately, it's not as well looked at. As I'm wrapping up here, this is what I just kind of wanted to touch base with about kind of the old way and then kind of where we are today. Transportation concurrency is where it started back in about 1985. And so when you did a study, you did a concurrency study, you identified improvements that had to be built, and then you also paid transportation impact fees. So you hit 2. Now, if you did an improvement, you could get credits for that. But that no longer is done, because right now what we have in the county and certainly the city as well is mobility fees that trying to identify a fee that is paid by every development. So if you had done a concurrency study back in the 90s or even the 2000s up until 2011, you could have done a study. Now you would have paid your impact fee, but if you did a concurrency study and you didn't have any impacts, you didn't have to pay anything. Well, nowadays you have a mobility fee. You have to pay something no matter what. And you'll see as I give a couple slides that I actually stole from a Sarasota County presentation, so they're not exactly probably the numbers that are in there, but they deal with mobility fees, and I think it's important because that is not necessarily something that everybody knows, and it's important to realize that these fees are going to improvements and what kind of improvements they are, and I'll talk about that in just a second. For instance, again, these were taken from a Sarasota County presentation at the board. There are these districts, 3 districts that are identified because different areas of the county obviously have different types of trip characteristics. And one of the things that I talked about early on were that, remember the old way of traffic studies where if you had an improvement and you couldn't pay for it, well, you kept on moving out and out? Well, nowadays, infill and redevelopment, that is encouraged because obviously you already have the infrastructure already in place in so many places. So in areas, and you'll see in the next slide, that there are actually reductions that are given for that type of development. And this shows in certain of the different districts, these areas are basically where the urban infill, so these specific areas. And this is really to encourage development, redevelopment in areas, as opposed to the old suburban where you're going out and all types of infrastructure has to be built out that's very much more expensive than the existing infrastructure that's already built. So this is, and I'm just a slide or 2 away from wrapping up here. This is what they call the new mobility fee. And if you look back here, this was what was the 2013 impact fee rate, and this was what was actually adopted. So what was happening was that you would have, let's say, for a single family development, and again, they split it out into different types of, I guess, more specific, so you can identify the more specific in terms of the actual size, which is not done in a lot of places. So I give kudos to the county for for identifying that. And what you actually also have, I'll go quickly to this, is that they have tried to get more specific so the individual developments can be assessed more accurately. So again, that is a better thing. So back in the day when, if you look at the impact fees that were for this type of retail, it was all collected just under one land use. And now it's been broken out, so you have discount stores, you've got large-scale retail, you've got small neighborhood retail, and those are the type of things that are identified, which, again, help to more clearly identify the impacts there. And I think one of the things that is important to note in terms of the mobility fees are based upon a mobility plan. So a mobility plan has been developed by the county that's identified basically countywide improvements that are needed. Then it's backed in terms of to give the actual number of trips, and then the trips are assigned a dollar value, and that's what you see here. And just wrapping up the mobility fee, again, the great part about a mobility fee, and the reason if you might want to ask why move into mobility fees, well, mobility fees now can pay for non-motorized improvements. Back in the day, transportation improvements or transportation impact fees could only be for capacity enhancements like roadways. Now you can build for trails, for bikes, et cetera. And that's the beauty of mobility fees. Such as, and I know that, I'm not sure exactly, but I heard this, there's about $900,000 that was done for the Legacy Trail. So those types of things to get those types of multimodal aspect improvements are very important. So I don't want to go too far, so I'll turn that over to Chris and to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. How about before we bring Mark up, are there any, and we'll come back to this, but any burning questions right off the top of your head for Christopher? Yes, Dan.
Yeah, Christopher, I was very pleased to see you put up a slide talking about the advantages of traffic studies. It helps with capital improvement planning by local governments. It helps inform the boards and the public about the impacts. But what I'd like to ask you is this. Your firm, both in advocating for the public side and the developer side, I won't get into the propriety of that, has consistently advocated eliminating traffic studies for all but the operational impact, the immediate vicinity, turn lanes, intersection crashes, that kind of thing. And eliminating, you've been advocating with some mixed success, eliminating traffic studies that measure capacity impacts on the affected road network. With all those advantages of having those studies, why, for your developer clients and consulting for the public side as well, do you advocate eliminating those capacity analyses?
Would you summarize that question too?
Oh, yes. I think Dan is asking why would we want to advocate in the forum that actually right now Sarasota County is having to advocate for doing away with traffic studies when the advantages of what they bring, as we spoke of. And I'm not necessarily advocating for doing away with them. That is not the case. We actually had a meeting at Sarasota County's office just probably about a month ago where we talked about what will actually be evaluated. There are cases, certainly for concurrency studies, that are non-cap or concurrency comp plan amendments or cap studies. Those are full-fledged studies. The rezones and everything else that are still be done. Mobility fees are basically being identified that will be doing the place of that, but there are also the operational, the safety, and the multimodal aspects. So there are 3 aspects of a traffic study that will be done. And again, I guess to answer the real question, it's not necessarily our decision, obviously. And trust me, I do traffic studies. I kind of like traffic studies. If traffic studies go away, I don't have a job. So I think there's one part that certainly realizes that mobility fees, as Christine Robinson would say when she was on the board, what she was saying when she was advocating for the mobility fees was for no more studies based upon it was a pay and go. And we realized that there is some need to still have some level of traffic studies, operationally, safety, and multimodal aspect focused.
I don't think Christine ever advocated that, but to be clear, for anything other than an amendment to the comprehensive plan, your firm has consistently advocated, both for the public sector clients and I think mainly for your developer clients, eliminating capacity analysis, the impact on gridlock, which this is supposed to be all about, for rezoning, special exceptions, and site plans.
That's actually not correct. I mean,
Since the city of Venice, where your firm openly advocated that.
I'm not sure who that was. I'm not sure who that.
Let's move to the next question. We got a
Sorry.
disagreement here
Yep,
on this.
yep.
But yes, Michael.
You need to be straight.
I am. Thank you.
I think y'all listen to this room and probably get that city development study every month that shows all the buildings in the city, and I remember there's one month we had one that was something like 38 buildings in the city. And but they have been a CIS to each one. I don't know if any of them buildings are too small. But one of the frustrations that the citizens have is that we're not that interested in the CIS for each one. But we would like to have a cumulative traffic impact study. It tells us what's going to happen from all these buildings at the time. So I asked some very forums about the city that said, oh no, that can't happen. Not forum about the county. Oh no, it's impossible to have all these CISs up. And so I just would like to ask you, your opinion, why is it so hard to simply add up the traffic impact of all these different developments and then provide and say, okay, here's a number, and this is probably accurate within a certain range. The city tends to have a large overlap if the CIS is affecting each other, they can't get that number. But I think just what I know about math, you probably say, okay, within a certain margin of error, you will cumulatively say what it is. What's your comment on that?
So will you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I think the question is trying to identify, why can't, let's say, a city or county-wide, almost global study be done to identify what the impacts are of all the development? And the answer is it's a very difficult effort to do that because it's a moving target. I mean, there's a certain amount of traffic on the roadway at a snapshot every day, but then there's traffic that is coming to let's say, Sarasota County every day as well. But if you think about it, when you put in a new development, does that necessarily, all the people that are basically, let's say, in those 100 units or those 100 single-family homes, are those basically all folks that came from Georgia just to come down here? No, they probably moved into maybe that, or when you're doing an office building, are you basically creating all these new jobs that are just going to that new office building that's going to be over in Fruitville? Nope, they're probably going to be moving from here to here. And it's just very difficult to be able to do a quote-unquote, if you want to call it a community or a regional study that takes into account, I mean, to give that example of 30 different developments and how to do that. So to accurately assess that how 30 can be done, it really is, it's sometimes difficult to do one large study like we had, the developments of regional impact, when you're taking into account, traffic from, vested traffic. So we can do that, and we could try to do it as best we can. We take a look at what's on the snapshot of what's existing, what's been approved, and then what we're adding. So the level of, as you add more traffic and more developments, as you get greater and greater, obviously the accuracy is going down at that point. So, I've worked on a DRI that probably's taken into consideration 12 or 13 developments. Getting into the 30 level, it's really not it's not accurate, unfortunately. Well, unfortunately, if you do 10 different studies, they're not all done exactly the same way. I will give, again, kudos to Sarasota County, who's doing a synchro network to try to identify, all of the intersections, signalized intersections specifically within the county, so that they have information and do counts there, so they could actually look at a certain corridor to be able to identify what the impacts there are based on existing counts, upon the data that they get and then they receive, so that they can give that information as accurately as possible. So those proactive efforts by the local jurisdictions that you have here, and again, I'll just say that, and I'm not just saying this, even though I've worked majority of my career in Sarasota County, it's both the city and the county have done an amazing job of identifying guidelines and the criteria and the methodology that we have to follow, and have held us to that standard for many, many years.
All right, let's move to Mark here, and both Christopher and Mark will be back here to take some more questions. Mark Lyons.
Thank you, Chris and Chris. Hi. My next 56 slides will be on. Oh, no, I don't have that much time. Right, that's an easy one. But Chris asked me tonight to talk a little bit about how parking relates to traffic congestion. And it's not always such an obvious world. So I only have 4 or 5 slides here to bring out some of the obvious scenarios that we ought to be looking at in this environment, and how we can consider making changes that will be positive. So let me move forward. A lot of you know me. I'm not going to spend time introducing myself or going on and on, but let me tell you, of course, we really need to understand what causes downtown congestion, because I'm going to focus not on the county and not the city as a whole, but we go into pockets. And my operational experience would be focusing on how we correct things in an immediate area. Downtown congestion is caused by a lot of different reasons, whether it's trucks loading and unloading, whether it's blocking traffic for somebody getting out of a car on temporary drop-offs or whatnot. But these things impact your larger scale congestion issues, and inside the city, they're very critical. I think one thing that really impacts congestion is understanding the relationship to walking. And Chris has done a lot of work locally on walking, and our community has looked very carefully at making sure we have a walkable environment. But when it comes to parking and creating traffic congestion, the question is, how far will people walk, really? And how does that impact what we do? Let me kind of skip ahead. This slide is I actually took this out of a Denver study where they did a strategic plan, and they surveyed residents to find out what their idea about an acceptable walking distance would be. And it kind of spreads out the type of activity or the type of parking that takes place with how much time is required for that parking, and then also looks at the distance that people are willing to walk. And if you can just sort of take a peek at this and see that the quick drop-offs at the very top generally are only a few minutes in length. But the optimal location is going to be right in front of the location where they want to park. And conversely, if you go to a commuter or an employee down here at the bottom, they're going to park all day long, and they're willing to walk 4 or 5 blocks. Well, why is this important? Well, if somebody is looking for a parking space, let's say an employee who wants to get the best parking space, but maybe he doesn't want this today. Maybe he needs 1 block. He's going to keep circulating and creating havoc in the downtown environment and congestion just by searching for that space. Many of you may be familiar with Don Shoop. And Don Shoop, a lot of you here probably are, but let me tell you, those who aren't, Don Shoop is an interesting guy who was a professor at UCLA and started studying urban renewal environments and traffic. And as he continued studying those 2 items, he found that parking is probably the most common component of those 2 issues. With good parking and effective parking, transportation and urban renewal could be very successful, and congestion then brought way down. So let me just give you a little background here on this information in front of you. He did various studies, and one of the first things he figured out is that between 1927 and 2001, there were some 16 studies done on traffic congestion. And what he found is about 30% of all vehicles that you see in these prime areas or congested areas in downtown are just searching for parking spaces. So this has a significant impact, as you might imagine, on the convenience and the ease of movement within the downtown, and certainly backs up out into the arteries as well, and the primary roads. He went on to study in Manhattan area, and in 2006 and 2007, they found that 28% of the drivers in Manhattan and 45% of them in Brooklyn were just cruising for curb parking. That's a lot of cars. And then they studied the upper Manhattan area, and they aggregated a lot of what they were looking at, and they realized on average people were looking for about 3.1 minutes, which equated to 3/10 or almost 4/10 of a mile. And if you look at that over a year, you realize that's a lot of miles. It's a lot of carbon emissions in the environment, and it has a big impact on not only our immediate block faces, but what happens outside of those areas as well. So the question became for Don Shoop, how do we change that? How do we improve the traffic congestion, improve our environment in the downtown and the urban environment? And he asked, well, if we can get rid of these cars cruising around and all the congestion that's taking place, where would cars go and what would happen? I don't know, any suggestions? Any thoughts? Well, what he said was, is he looked at it and he said, you know what will really happen if you manage parking through some pricing means, and you do it properly, you'll find that the average time spent searching for cars without a management system is 3.5 minutes. But if you have the right price on the curb, you'll find, like this illustration shows, there's always a space for somebody to park. And so these studies have been proven for quite a long time, and they prevent the backup on the streets, into the side streets, into the alleyways, and which makes life difficult for all of us. So in the end, the message is drivers would spend less time driving, and they'd have shorter trips, and they would improve the environment. The city's doing some things to try and help that out. And here I'm going to share with you a couple things that we're doing, but there's a lot of different ideas that have been floated and different programs that we can use. But the city of Sarasota right now is promoting the IRide. Many of you are familiar with them. They use electrical vehicles to move people around downtown with the concept that we would get people to park and then use IRide to get around. Instead of getting in your car and then driving again a half a mile to another location, utilize this type of service as a means to relieve congestion in the immediate area. Another thing we're working on is a program called Street Line. They're a vendor that goes out and actually puts sort of sensors in the street so that we can evaluate and measure how many cars are parking in various areas. This is a slide from one of the city's own aggregated data that we might have. We've been putting these sensors in downtown from Main Street all the way down to the Bayfront, the Southside Village, and also in St. Armand's and Lido. And so the idea here is that if we can understand, instead of actually going out and counting all the cars, which I know Chris probably likes to do, and with traffic studies and so forth, by having this type of technology that tells us when cars are actually out on the street and how long they're on the street, then we can measure the effectiveness of all our parking systems and determine how we best manage those. This is a report that goes in more detail, but the interesting thing here is that they also provide us an app that will allow parkers to save time by using this app. They can locate a parking space in downtown or any one of these areas. And I would invite you right now, if you're interested, or later, to go to the Play Store, the Google Store, or the App Store, and you can download the Parker app. That's the name of it. It's called Parker. And you'll find that it's a very convenient app that will actually direct you around town to open parking spaces. I'd like to give you a live demo, but it's kind of difficult on the computer, but this illustration is pretty good. This is a real picture of what the app would look like. And you can just look at that and intuitively know that green probably means good and red probably means bad. So on the app itself, you can look at this and decide, well, where's my best option for parking? And this app will guide you to the area in town where available parking would be. So if I wanted to go to State Street, I would actually just push on the screen on State Street, and it will map my route to the best route to State Street. And then when I arrive, the app will actually recognize that I'm in that location and mark my parking spot. Now, the other thing that it will do is also identify the amount of time restriction, or if there was any pay system involved, it would do that too. But it will tell you when your time is expired at your parking space and give you a notice so that you can get back and avoid getting ticketed by my staff. One of the nice features, of course, of this system. And then, of course, if you get lost in downtown, you can push a button, it'll map you back to your car. And so it's very convenient. We hope that people will begin to start using it. I'd like everyone to accurate data than what we have already. And the more parkers using the apps, it'll be even more helpful. So make sure you take a look at that. And that's essentially it. That's a quick wrap of what we were going to talk about. Okay.
Okay, do we have any fresh new questions? I see Dan's got another question. Anyone else got a new? Yes, right here. Wes.
Sure. I had a question for Chris from before.
Christopher, you, where do you run off to?
Something I missed, but the chart of mobility fees was based, and there's, I can tell, 1,000 square foot correlated to the type of use of the structure, right?
Well,
Say like a residential.
it would actually be a unit, for instance. So it would be a single family, like a unit, but it was based upon the size of that.
And so then it was a set
No, actually, there was as I mentioned, there was a mobility plan that was done, which basically tried to evaluate. And again, there was different districts, so there would be different fee amounts for different districts. Right, right. So, I mean, again, this is almost going back to the gentleman back there of how hard it is to do that. But in terms of trying to assess the amount of trips that are basically going to happen in those districts, what improvements are going to be needed, and then how to pay for them. And then, so they were basically assigned a dollar value.
Those districts were east-west.
Right.
So the impact of a new coffee shop being built in the heart of downtown Sarasota in terms of number of trips and traffic impact is the exact same financial cost as the same type of coffee shop built on Fruitville out by the interstate?
If it's in the actual same, district, in that case it is. Now, there are different areas, like I said, if it's in you saw the infill, for instance. So if you're looking at a place that's a downtown, that's an infill identified area, it's going to be a much more reduced rate than it would be if it's out near I-75. So those are those types of nuances that do take into place. So, and again, there are things called independent studies. So if you went in there and a development came in and was assessed a mobility fee of X number of dollars based upon this, again, and it's not an easy study to do, but it was one that had to be done for mobility plan to calculate into a mobility fee. Each development has the right to be able to do an independent study. So if you say I'm being assessed X number of trips, and again, the different variables are the trip length, the trip type, and the number of trips, you can do a specific study that, again, is reviewed by the jurisdiction that says, I don't want to be lumped into all of that general numbers. I want to do it specifically. But they have to pay for it. So it's one of those, do you want to pay for it to do a study to have more accurate numbers? Then that would be assessed. So you could do that.
Yes, another question?
I just wanted to clarify the street line sensors app. Does that factor in garages as well? Because I'm guessing they don't know how many parking spots are in a garage and can't determine how many are empty or open.
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, the question is, does the Streetline app include the parking spaces within the off-street parking garages and lots, I assume, as well? It's an interesting, we're using a hybrid system. Several years ago, they would put a sensor in each and every parking space at the cost of about $100,000 to $150,000 a block. Today, this is a technology that the city is taking advantage of and really sort of beta testing. We're one of the first around the country to utilize it. And what they do is, instead of doing every space, they do a few spaces on each block. And then there's calculations and algorithms that I would never be able to explain that identify the mathematical possibility that these spaces are occupied or unoccupied. And they're not, again, reporting an exact calculation. That's why we're giving general, red, green, yellow, and so forth. But it does not do those off-street areas. There's other systems that are utilized, and some of that's going to be coming online, and we can actually tie those into the app as well. So you'll see that down the road. Yeah, thanks for asking.
I saw one more, yeah, back there.
Right.
So what are the plans? I know there are plans for water transportation. How's that going to be?
Well, and I know there are water taxis in the city and other areas, again, that are being done. There are certain, I know the city of St. Petersburg has just finished up a pilot study as well in terms of ferry back between Tampa and St. Pete. And they actually found incredibly good, surprisingly good, I should say, ridership for that. I don't know that plays into it, because remember, if you look at the table, then when we looked at mode split, I don't think we're ever going to get to a 30%. But depending on certain areas, I mean, hey, if we make impacts of 2 to 5 to 10%, certainly we've got to start sometime. So things like such as water taxis and the others that are being developed, I love certainly the car ride around town and such like that, the downtowner and other ones that they have. Those are the type of things to get people out of their single occupancy vehicles into certain different modes, which is something I certainly advocate for.
One last question right here in the front row. Go ahead, Francine.
I've sat through 3 of these, and I have yet to hear one person talk about commuter sponsorship, where, people have riders in their cars. It seems like we have this mentality that there's only one person per car. And in New England and other places, they even have commuter lots.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And we don't have any, nobody's even talked about the fact that there is a possibility for ride sharing to cut back on the number of wheels on the pavement.
Well, and her question was about ride sharing and commuter opportunities. I will tell you, for instance, the FDOT actually, they do sponsor commuter rides, and they actually give vouchers and gift certificates if you actually have commuter rides that you can actually say that you're carpooling. They will actually sponsor you. And there's other things that are being done by employees, that basically employees will actually try. Now that's usually on a private side that's being done, and that's in terms of certainly being able to identify people that can carpool, and they can pool their resources to be able to do that to help get single occupancy vehicles off the road. So, yep, sure.
Let me share on that point for a minute, because I've worked in a lot of various cities around the country, and most of the public facilities have always had some sort of ride share parking space allocated to those facilities. And I would say at most 2 or 3 spaces, maybe 4 spaces have been allocated in large parking garages and parking lots and even spaces out on the street. And I unfortunately will report to you that I never saw them used. And these are in cities that are known for well-integrated transportation systems. So I know that we want to get there. My concern is sometimes we may not be ready to actually deploy those. Not to say that we shouldn't try, but I'm not sure. They're not going to be a panacea, and they probably aren't going to even get have a significant. That's why I don't disagree. We should. Yeah.
Well, Francine, you've got to come back for week number 5, because that's the subjects we're going to talk about right there. I know there's a number of other questions here, and I apologize. I do have to wrap it up. Dan, no, Dan. I'm gonna give you an opportunity to let me just give me a second. These guys are available. All the experts we've had here. We do have a vehicle for asking more questions here. There is a handout on the table when you leave tonight. So if you have other questions you'd like to publicize, Dan, I'm trying to get us wrapped out so people can get out. I've got a couple more now. Dan, I'm not trying to silence. You already asked a question.
The chamber has an agenda.
Dan, please.
And all you're doing is pushing that agenda.
Dan, write a letter to the editor. Please, let us finish up. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a couple of more announcements here. Dan, would you please respect the crowd here? Okay, you can have your own series, Dan. So just a couple more announcements. Andrew Georgiadis is going to be here next week. Andrew, many of you know, work with Karen at the Urban Design Studio. Andrew's got a big career that started off down in Miami. He's been a professor down there. He worked with Dover Cole, who wrote the book Great Streets. He's got a very broad-minded point of view about how to create a great city and great streets. And he's going to be here talking about a number of different subjects. And again, a lot of it relating directly to our community here, because again, he had a couple of years that he spent with us. But I think some really interesting subjects, like the subject called Healing the Grid, which has to do with some streets that we've got that have disconnected that we could use to help reduce some of the congestion we have. So I think you'll find that very interesting with his upcoming talk. And again, I want to the handout that's out on the table, a couple different purposes. All the next few weeks are outlined there. There is again, as I was saying to Dan, there is a vehicle there for asking more questions for anyone you'd like to ask, and also there is the last thing that's on there. If you're interested in the slides that have been presented, we're videoing all of these. The slides are available, so there's a resource for doing that. And again, Dan, if you'd like to write a letter to the editor or run your own series, you're welcome to do that. But we are concluded. Thank you all very much for being here. Thanks.